introduction, the Friends of the Weston Public Library is a volunteer organization that provides programming and activities for the library, as well as provide financial support when possible. For those of you who are not members, I encourage you to join our group by filling out one of the forms that are available in the back table and providing us with your email address so that we can notify you of all of the wonderful programs that we have here at the library and all the events that take place here as well. Our organization depends on membership, dues, and donations from the community, so any donation that you are able to make would be deeply appreciated. We would like to thank the Historical Society for coordinating the series and allowing us to co-sponsor it with them. There will be 2 additional films here at the library, as well as 2 lectures, one at the library and one at the Historical Society.
Which one is at the Historical Society?
It's the one that's on September 23rd. That's it, September 23rd. There is actually a flyer in the back that you can take that has the list of all the events for the series and the times and the dates and where they are. I would like at this moment to introduce Arnold de Kaiser, a member of the Historical Society that is here tonight, who would like to tell you about the World War I exhibit at the Historical Society.
Good evening. I'm the advertisement between the introduction and the main feature. I am with the Historical Society. I'm delighted to see trustees here, and of course, all of you are going to become members of the Historical Society as well as members of the Friends of the Library, 2 great causes in town. Books, information, history, you've got it all here. I just wanted to say a brief word about our exhibition. The Coley Homestead, 104 Weston Road, is the property on which the Historical Society is located. We have a museum that we built with generous contributions a few years ago. We now have an executive director, and she has put together an amazing exhibition of World War I photos, posters, memorabilia, artifacts, and interestingly, many of these artifacts, memorabilia, have come from Weston residents who've had relatives or friends of earlier generations who served in that war. So you'll see Congressional Medals of Honor, you'll see some weapons, you'll see letters and other memories. And the exhibition is open Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 4 this month, and next month on Sundays. And if you are interested in a special tour or a group of people who would like to come on a separate visit, you're welcome to do that. Just call the Society. So we're glad to be here. Thank you to the Friends for helping us put this together, and I'm sure we'll enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Dr. Gordinier. Tonight we are pleased to present the second lecture in our new lecture series on World War I. The lecture tonight is entitled The War on the Seas and will be presented by Dr. Gordinier. I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Gordinier on behalf of the Friends of the Library and the Weston Historical Society. Dr. Gordinier is the Robert G. Albion Historian at Mystic Seaport. He is also a visiting scholar at the University of Connecticut, Avery Point, where he teaches history. Dr. Gordinier has served as a Smithsonian Institution lecturer and a visiting instructor for Trinity College as well as Connecticut College. His publications have involved maritime commerce, seafaring culture, and issues of race and ethnicity. I would like now to introduce Dr. Gordinier.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I was here a couple of years ago speaking about the War of 1812 in Connecticut, and I was very impressed with the audience, its understanding and its interest. It's clearly a sophisticated and committed audience here, so it's a pleasure to be back. It's a long drive, but it's worth it. So thank you for having me. My day job, I teach for UConn part-time. I've taught for those other schools. My day job is teaching for Williams College. Williams has 2 off-campus programs, one at Oxford University and the other one at Mystic Seaport. This is a semester-long study-away maritime studies, focusing on the oceans and the coastal zones of the world. I teach the history course. All the students take the same course as history, literature, science, and policy of the sea. Very unique, in-depth, no pun intended, investigation of our relationships with the world's oceans. In fact, when I get home tonight, I'll stay up a little bit late because our students are on their way now back from Southern California, where they just spent 10 days sailing a three-masted barkentine out to the Channel Islands, and taking samples of the sea and standing watch through the night and that sort of thing. I'll be happy to greet them back on dry land where it still feels a little bit like summer. So anyway, thank you for having me. And well, why don't we begin? So here we are, World War I, the war on the seas. And of course, World War I, one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. Little political cartoon here on the right showing the leadership of Europe sort of trying to hold down this bubbling pot, this cauldron of trouble, which eventually, as we all know, in the late summer of 1914, bubbled over and resulted in just this tragic First World War. It need not have bubbled over necessarily if it wasn't for the fellow we see on the left. This is Cousin Willie, as they referred to him in Queen Victoria's household. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was, for all intents and purposes, the king of Germany. And he had a big army, and he had the technology, and he really wanted to sort of prove himself as a great emperor, as had people like Napoleon and others before him. And unfortunately, the fact that he did have a vast army and the latest technology and the resources that gave him the confidence, he helped propel the Western world into this long and tragic debacle, which is represented in everyone's imagination with images of the Western Front and the fields of Flanders and just the months and years of stalemate, men being sent over the top into a hail of gunfire as we see these German soldiers being mowed down by the machine gun, which was the deadly weapon of the day. Mr. Maxim had created it, figuring it was so devastating no one would fight any longer. People would be mowed down in such numbers that war would come to an end. That was his idea. Of course, we could say the same thing about atomic weapons and others, but we tend to find that no matter how terrible the weaponry becomes, we continue to fight. So on we go into this horrible affair. But our focus tonight isn't on that, because to be honest, I couldn't tell you a whole lot about trench warfare. But I can speak for a short while about the maritime and the naval aspects of the First World War. So that's going to be our focus here, this war that began just 100 years ago, last month. And talk about modern technologies. We had modern technologies then as well. And I'll speak about how we got to those a little bit and what we did with those. But I'm also going to sort of talk about this, and a lot of my talk is going to be about the larger context of naval and maritime affairs in the First World War. For instance, we could look at the British merchant fleet. In 1914, 43% of the world's merchant fleet was flying the red duster, as they called it, the British flag at the stern. They had 21 million tons of shipping. The next largest maritime nation, turns out, was Germany. Germany had 12%. The British had 43%. The Germans had 12% of the world's merchant fleet with 5.5 million tons. So the British, 21 million tons. Next largest, Germany, 5.5 million tons. So we can see that the British dominate. After them come nations like France, Japan, the United States, and Norway, each of them having about 1.8 million tons. But I do need to point out that of America's 1.8 million tons, about 80% of that was in our coastal fleet. Very few of our vessels could compete on the global market in the late 19th and early 20th century. We were just, our ships, much like today, operating ships under the American flag was much too expensive And so we shrunk away from that because we could be undercut by people like Japan or Norway or the British or the French. And so our foreign fleet was just a shadow of its former self. It really was quite pathetic, and there was one conference, one convention, one speech in Congress after another about how to bolster the American foreign fleet, and it all came to naught. So we were very weak in that regard coming into 1914. The British, however, of course, it was a different story because the British Empire, on which, as we all know, the sun never set, the British Empire was a maritime empire. There's debates as well about what is the nature of empire. Is there an American empire today? If we talk about an economic empire, you can make a good case for it. If you talk about a military empire, we're sort of all over the place there as well. But there's no question that the British Empire, no matter how much it was backed by the military, the British Empire was a maritime empire. And that fleet helped them do that. And with that, 2/3 of the food that came to the British table came by sea. They needed their merchant fleet to bring food to the tables of the subjects of the British Crown. So when war breaks out in 1914, Winston Churchill feels that he can threaten with the Royal Navy, the world's strongest navy, had been the world's strongest navy for, gee, how long now? Almost 250 years. The world's strongest navy had suffered one fleet defeat in about 2.5 centuries. That fleet defeat happened to be at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay during the American Revolution, a defeat to the French, which allowed George Washington to force Cornwallis to surrender, which brought an end to the American Revolution and our independence being acknowledged by the British. In all of those years, those decades, those centuries, that was the only time the British lost a fleet action. The Royal Navy was overpowering. And so when war broke out, Winston Churchill, young Winston Churchill, who was central to the operation of the Royal Navy, made a threat that the Royal Navy could strangle Germany. And in response to that, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the name Tirpitz may be familiar to you from the Second World War, one of their battleships named after him, his response was, quote, "England wants to starve us, we can play the same game. We can bottle her up and torpedo every English or Allied ship that nears any harbor in Great Britain, thereby cutting large food supplies," end quote. So both of them, thinking very much about the maritime affairs, about naval affairs, not just what's happening in the fields of France and Belgium. And a lot of that goes back to, actually, as it turns out, an American historian. Watch out for those American historians. You never know what influence they might have. And in fact, this particular man probably had more influence than most any other historian of the modern age. His name is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He had served in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. He had served out on one of those blockading ships, month after month, bored as the Dickens. But after that, he was a scholar at heart. And so he started doing a lot of research, and as the Navy began to modernize in the 1880s and 1890s, they created the Naval War College. And the building we see over here on the right, that is now called Mahan Hall. It was originally the local poorhouse. But come 1890 or so, the U.S. Navy opened it as its Naval War College for senior naval officers to study the art of naval warfare. The undergraduates would go to the Naval Academy, but if you were a senior officer and you wanted advanced training, you'd go to the Naval War College, as they still do today. This is the penultimate education you can get if you're a Navy man, not only from the United States, but from all over the world. The head of the Pakistani Navy is a graduate of the Naval War College. The head of the Indian Navy, hopefully, luckily, is also a graduate of the Naval War College today. But back in the 1890s, it was brand new, and Alfred Thayer Mahan was its first historian. So he did what historians do. He looked back at the historical record, and he was interested in navies, and he was interested in nation states and how they competed. And by looking at the historical record, he determined that the best way to be a competitive nation state is to have a strong sea presence, to have sea power. And this is sort of his theory that I've put together for us. At the top, if you want to be a competitive nation state, and his view was either you were competitive, you were growing and increasing your competitive strength position, or you were shrinking. There was no status quo. You were either getting more competitive or less competitive. If you wanted to be competitive, and of course we did, you wanted expanding foreign commerce. And he says this right in the middle of the darkest age for America's foreign fleet. He says, if you want to be competitive, America, you need expanding foreign commerce. To do that, to the right, you need a strong merchant marine. How can you have expanding foreign commerce without a strong merchant marine? To support your strong merchant marine, off on the next row down on the left, you want distant colonies. That's what the historical record taught him. The greatest maritime power on the planet had distant colonies. And what you needed for those distant colonies were secure ports of destination that were located in those distant colonies. And to have those ports and those colonies, you needed protection at sea. To have protection at sea, you needed a powerful blue water navy, which, as it turns out, particularly in the age of steam and coaling stations, that navy is supported by distant colonies. So it's kind of a nice little circular argument that he could make. Of course, this was the age of steam power, and you needed your distant colonies where you could stockpile coal so that your navy could go across the Atlantic and arrive in the Caribbean and coal up and do whatever it needed to do, or perhaps get halfway across the Pacific. As it runs low on fuel, you stop at a colony and you coal up on fuel, and then you can carry on to do whatever you want. Or you come around the Cape of Good Hope and you coal up to the Indian Ocean. And he determined this actually by studying the age of sail. And he determined that it was the Royal Navy and it was the British that are the great exemplar. And he wrote a book based on his lectures at the War College entitled The Importance of Sea Power in History, 1690 to 1783. So if we look at those years, we're talking the Royal Navy. And even before steam came, Mahan had determined that to be competitive, you needed sea power. To have sea power, you needed a navy, you needed colonies, the navy supported, and on it went. And so these images sort of give us that. We see at the top center there's a colony with all sorts of ships and a strong merchant marine. Down on the lower left, we see a strong naval vessel and the kind of coaling stations on the lower right that can support all that. This is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He had a number of proponents here in the United States. The most famous and the most important is one that many of you are quite familiar with nowadays, and of course, that is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy, as it turns out, when the Spanish-American War began, was the Undersecretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy was, again, you probably maybe saw this on TV not too long ago. The Secretary of the Navy was out of town, so Teddy determined that the Navy should be involved, and he dispatched his ships to the Philippines and to Cuba, and then thought, well, that's the end of me when it comes to glory and fame. So he retired, he resigned and created his own military unit, of course, the Rough Riders, and then went on to true fame, one of America's great self-taught military geniuses, cool under fire. He was a legitimate hero when the time came. And eventually, of course, his heroism in the Spanish-American War carries him into the White House, where he has a foreign policy based on Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories. And his foreign policy is very simple: speak softly and carry a big stick. And the big stick is what we see over there on the left side of the image. That is Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which he sent around the world in 1905 so that they could have cotillions and have banquets and be welcomed by all the dignitaries of the nations they visited. And also, as he sailed into Kobe or sailed into Sydney or wherever he was going, he could say, if we wanted to be here with the biggest ships in our Navy, we can be here. Here we are. We'll have a nice time now, but the message was clear. The Great White Fleet was his big stick. And so there we were with our first generation of a truly modern Navy, thanks to Alfred Thayer Mahan and President Theodore Roosevelt. But even as the Great White Fleet was making its way around the world, it was obsolete. Because the British, they weren't going to be caught napping. They saw what we were doing and what other nations were doing, And so they built the next generation of battleship. This is HMS Dreadnought, the first of the great modern battleships. She was more powerful than any other vessel, had 14-inch guns that could fire over 10 miles, a whole series of smaller cannon. She was the fastest large ship on the ocean. She had heavy armor. She had all the capabilities that one needed to dominate a theater of war. HMS Dreadnought, and as many of you know, that's a term that is still used today. It's sort of a generic term. It's a synonym for battleship. A battleship today is still often referred to informally as a dreadnought. And that's the way it's been ever since this particular vessel was launched in 1906. So Teddy's fleet's not even halfway around the world and it's already obsolete. And what this sets up and carries forward for the next almost decade is a naval race, a competition in building naval might. And so the British, the French, the Italians, the United States, and most particularly relative to what we're going to be getting into, Germany, all determined that they need to be involved in this arms race, particularly with navies, because of these global colonized empires. And they had to make decisions, much like we see them do today in today's modern military technologies. So, in a battleship, you could have large guns. Okay, the larger your gun, the more expensive it was going to be. The deeper its draft was going to be because of the weight of the gun. The less flexible that ship's uses would be, but it could carry much more punch. So you could have 10-inch guns, but if you had 14-inch guns, you could throw your more weight a further distance, but then you lost out on things like speed. You lost out on savings. You needed deep water to travel. Well, you could also carry thick armor, but the thicker your armor was to make you invulnerable to the heavy guns of another navy, you would have more weight, which would make you go slower and would use more fuel. So the distances you could cover and how quickly you could cover those distances would be compromised by thicker armor. Of course, the lighter the armor, the faster, the more maneuverable, the more fuel efficient you are, but then the more vulnerable you become. All of these things are in play. And then when it came to speed, well, again, less armor makes you faster, but more vulnerable. So what sort of capital ships did you want? And as it turns out, the image we have here is actually one of the great battleships of the Japanese Navy of this era, of the 19-teens. So it looks to me like a very modern warship, and so it was. The Japanese, one of the great competitors in this arms race, this naval arms race. So when the First World War breaks out, England and Germany, who were really the ones facing off against each other, they had this enormous weight that they could throw at each other. England focused most of its vessels in what they called the Grand Fleet. Germany focused its larger vessels in what they call the High Seas Fleet. You can kind of get a sense from those two terms what they thought of these two groupings of vessels, the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet. A High Seas Fleet has one purpose, and that's to get into the high seas and to go into harm's way. Most naval authorities assumed that there would be some sort of definitive slugfest between these two great naval fleets, and that would determine the naval war and possibly the whole war itself. The High Seas Fleet was bottled up on the German coast by a Royal Navy blockade. They were sitting out there waiting for the Germans to break out. They made 2 attempts, both of which were thwarted, and they ran back in for protection. But then eventually, in May of 1916, almost 2 years after the war began, the High Sea Fleet does break out, and here we see them underway, under full steam. You can see all the smoke here, and they are met by several squadrons of British warships. Here's the British Grand Fleet as it turns to starboard in unison, and they meet at what is known in history as the Battle of Jutland. And the two pounded away at each other for most of the day here in May of 1916. You can see the German fleet breaking out, these different British squadrons focusing on them, and then you can see the maneuvers here off to the right. the British in blue, the Germans in red. The Germans in the lower one doing a very hard 180-degree turn, several 180-degree turns as the British sort of circle them and they bombard each other. Early in the battle, two of the Royal Navy's great heavy cruisers, the Indefatigable, and 20 minutes later the Queen Mary, were destroyed. Here's an image of the Indefatigable beginning to go, and here is what, literally in the blink of an eye, happened to the Queen Mary. It was just shocking, unexpected, unprecedented. Admiral Jellicoe, who was in command of the Grand Fleet, said famously that something seemed to be wrong with their ships that day. And what was wrong was their design. They had a couple of design issues that for plunging shells, they were very vulnerable. And what happened here with the Queen Mary is a German shell penetrated to the magazine and the whole ship just went up, as you see in the blink of an eye. Just horrifying. Thousands of men lost just that quickly. But the battle carried on, and in fact the Royal Navy did force the Germans back into their home port. However, the Brits lost more than twice as many men and larger ships than the Germans did at the Battle of Jutland. And so the Germans claimed a victory, a naval victory, as it never happened before. Even back there at the old Chesapeake Bay, that was nothing like the scale of this victory against the Royal Navy. And so the British, Admiral Jellicoe was sort of shunted off and into the office, so he was no longer a field commander or a high seas commander. The British kind of were trying to assess just what this all meant. Well, it turns out over time, it becomes clear that although the British suffered more losses in these capital ships, as they were called, they had succeeded. They had turned the high seas fleet back. And in fact, it would never sortie again. The German fleet was eventually turned over to the Allied forces at the end of the war. So this was the last great duel between battleships. So the traditions of Lepanto, Trafalgar, Tsushima, and others, we've never seen such a thing again. The Battle of Jutland was the last of these. And so then the question is, here we are, it's May of 1916, but the Maritime War goes on, so what is its character? Well, its character has a lot to do with those claims that Admiral Tirpitz and Winston Churchill made earlier in the war. If it wasn't capital ships, then what was it? It all had to do with foodstuffs and material being blockaded from your enemy. The Royal Navy threatened to do that with surface ships. Admiral Tirpitz, when he talked about torpedoing, of course, he was thinking about using submarines. And so what they wanted to do was restrict British shipping, and they saw this as a decisive strategy to bring the war to a positive outcome for Germany. Submarine warfare was key to the German war strategy. And they start the war actually with only 29 U-boats, that's all they have. But they can be very effective. Within the first 10 weeks, 5 British cruisers were lost to German U-boats. The first of them is the one we see here. This is September 1914. HMS Pathfinder was sunk by one of those German U-boats. And you can see a torpedo attack that just caused immediate destruction. She was the first ship to be sunk by an enemy submarine using a self-propelled torpedo. This was the moment where that new style of warfare that we're so familiar with took place. And then just 2 weeks later, another German U-boat sank 3 British warships within 1 hour. That was the HMS Abercorn, HMS Cressy, and HMS Hogue. And these were relatively obsolete ships, but they were out on patrol, blockading up there in the North Sea. And it was suggested that these ships might not be up to the job. They're a little old, they're a little slow, but it's all the British had at that time. They were still increasing the size of the Navy, so they said, stay out there, we'll get more modern vessels there shortly. And up comes U-9. And first hits Aboukir with a torpedo. She goes down. HMS Cressy slows because Aboukir, they thought that she had hit a sea mine, so she slowed to to make sure there were no mines, but of course as she slows, she makes herself a target for the U-9 again, so she is hit, and then HMS Hope comes up and does what sailors would do in those days, stops to pick up survivors. There are hundreds, thousands of men in the water, well, hundreds at least, others, many dead. And so HMS Hope stops to pick up survivors. It's what you do, and of course, set herself up as a target as well. So all three of those vessels. And this is a moment in maritime history and naval history where what you do when your allies, when your shipmates, when another vessel you're traveling with is in trouble, what you do is you don't stop. You move on, because if you stop, you are now vulnerable to submarine attack as well. The lesson was well learned here in September of 1914. And so the Germans believed, and they had pretty good evidence here, that they could strangle Great Britain by sinking enough tonnage to bring about peace on good terms. And so they moved to indiscriminately and in an unrestricted fashion torpedo and sink vessels, either torpedo or sink vessels by gunfire, where if it was an unarmed vessel, they would surface, and to save the torpedoes, they would open up with a deck gun and sink the vessel with a deck gun. And so they did this to Allied shipping. The most infamous of these attacks was in May of 1915, and this is the sinking of the Lusitania, the British passenger vessel, 30,000 tons, one of the largest passenger vessels in the world at the time. Many others have been sunk by them, but on May 7th, 1915, Lusitania is torpedoed off the English coast. She sinks within 18 minutes. Nearly 1,200 people die in the debacle, including 128 Americans. The most famous of them, Alfred Vanderbilt, the heir to the Vanderbilt fortune. And there's always been debate ever since. Was she carrying contraband? Was she carrying ammunition? A lot of people claimed there was the torpedo explosion and then another larger explosion. Was that ammunition she was carrying? Eventually it was determined she was carrying guns, small arms, but not to the numbers that would make her vulnerable, or should make her by international agreement vulnerable to a submarine attack, and yet down she went. And many Americans believe this was the tipping point for the United States getting involved in the First World War, but not so. Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, demanded that Germany disavow the sinking of the Lusitania with all of its innocent civilians on board, particularly American citizens. He demanded reparations for these lost American lives, and he also demanded that Germany put a stop to unrestricted submarine warfare. And so Germany did this, in fact. They slowed down that activity to the point that, let's see, is this the, we'll stick with that image, I suppose. Oh, now I'm getting lost. Forgive me. So they actually backed away from unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning you torpedo anybody and everybody. And what they began to do was warn vessels that they were going to be sunk. They would surface and tell the crew to get off. Get into your lifeboat, move away, because we're going to sink your ship, which of course was much more humane. And so from May 1916 to January 1917, they did this. And I spoke to an old sailor, not a sailor, but a fisherman, who worked in a vessel much like this out of Gloucester. And he went back to in his youth, he used to sail in the old schooners where they would fish from dories. You'd sail out to the Grand Banks, wherever you'd anchor your schooner, and then the men would row in dories, these little 18-foot boats, and they'd row away, and they'd fish from the dories. That way you cover a lot more of the bottom. If you had 10 dories, you had thousands of hooks and covering acres of bottom rather than just over the side of the schooner. Well, as time went on, they took those old schooners like we see here and put motors in them and mechanized them, and then they could drag nets. Sort of the prototype of what we do now with our otter trawls. And he remembers, as a kind of a middle-aged fisherman, they've been told to watch out for submarines and that they look like logs. If you see a log floating in the water, shout out. And sure enough, there's a log floating in the water, and the log comes up, and it's a German submarine. And it hails his fishing vessel, and they lower a dory, and he rows the captain of the fishing vessel over to the submarine. And he remembered, the thing he remembers most distinctly at this point is hanging on, there's this big kind of metal tube, you know, and there's the German up there talking to his captain. He remembers bobbing up and down, hanging onto this German submarine. And the German said, I'm going to sink your ship, so you know, get your guys in the dories. And Newfoundland is, you know, 80 miles that way, so get rolling. And the other thing he remembers is that he was of the old doryman generation, the old sail dory generation, and there were a lot of guys on board that were half his age, and he said they just weren't up to it. They'd never been in a situation like that. They'd never been in a small boat in the open sea. And if it hadn't been for he and a couple of his old-time buddies on board, he figured most of those kids would have died just for lack of sort of the experience of facing raw nature like that. So anyway, one of those moments where that change in German policy had a benefit. But Woodrow Wilson was getting pretty frustrated. Okay, there had been Lusitania, there had been other Americans lost, and the idea was to stop the loss of Americans. And so he eventually pushes through the Navy Bill of 1916, where Congress begins to throw lots of money at naval construction. And they fund 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, and another 140 smaller vessels to modernize and bolster the U.S. Navy in 1916. And so that's the way we carried on through 1916. By early 1917, the Western Front, as I'm sure you know, has been stalemated for years. Hundreds of thousands lost. They'll launch this again. These men over the top to be mowed down, and you know, with 10,000 dead, you've gained 100 yards. And the next day, they charge and push you back. All just a horror story. The Germans were pretty tired of this. By early 1915, they're sending out peace feelers to the United States and to Great Britain, but we're sort of distracted by our internal politics. And so the Germans give up on the peace attempt. And the generals turn to the Navy and say, we think the only way we can come to a positive conclusion of this war is unrestricted submarine warfare. We need you to go out and strangle Great Britain because we can't do it. The armies cannot do it. You need to help us do it. One of the admirals, the German Admiralty, warned that this could very likely bring the United States into the war, unrestricted submarine warfare again. But they calculated that they had enough U-boats now that they could prevent American ships from bringing overwhelming forces to the European theater. So even if we did declare war on Germany and throw in, they could keep us at bay with their submarine technology. They warned us that unrestricted submarine warfare would return. Wilson went to Congress, this is the end of January 1917, and he warned Congress that a warboat might be in the offing. And then to frustrate Americans even more, you may be aware of this, there surfaced a German message to the government of Mexico. The Germans thought, you know, a second front wouldn't be bad. What if the Americans were distracted with a second Mexican-American war? Why not promise the Mexicans material support, financial support, military support to regain Arizona, New Mexico, the parts of Texas that they always claimed, of course, because it used to belong to them, but that's another story. And so they do send this, what seems to be just a fictive message, but in fact they did. They suggested that Mexico attack our southwestern frontier. And that really, of course, upset Wilson and the American Congress. And so by the spring of 1917, all of these things are sort of rattling around in the American psyche. And meanwhile, the Germans are sinking more vessels. They tripled the destruction of merchant vessels through the late winter and the spring of 1917. In April alone, they sunk almost 900,000 tons of shipping. Again, Lusitania was 30,000 tons, but she was massive. She was 5 times the size of the average merchant vessel. So we're talking many hundreds of vessels here being sunk by the German U-boats. Along with those other vessels, 7 of them were American vessels. 63 Americans were dead. So on April 6th of 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. Now you would think this is great, this is going to turn the tide, and actually it kind of does eventually, but in April of 1917, things were not looking good for the Allies in any way, shape, or form. First of all, we didn't sign on as an ally. We signed on as an associated power. I like that term. An associated power. I guess we were not part of the coalition of the willing. We were an associated power, not an ally. We wanted two things. We wanted Germany to stop its militaristic behavior, and we wanted an end to U-boat attacks. Those were our two goals. And actually what Wilson was thinking, you may remember at the end of the war, Wilson's 14 points and the League of Nations and all that, he had always had this grand vision of a new world being born out of the horrors of the First World War, and he saw himself as the person that could bring that about. So he always had this very sophisticated, kind of layered, subtle approach to where do we want to end up at the end of the war and where can we go from there, looking for this to be the war to end all wars. So he approaches things that way. Meanwhile, the Germans had been punishing the Allies. They were in a very bad place in April of 1917. They had lost several recent land battles on the Western Front. The Germans had defeated Russia, you may remember. The Germans had routed the Italians. Even Venice was just about in German hands. In every area, the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey had the upper hand. And then if we talk about things at sea, the average sinking per month was about 500,000 tons of shipping. And that's particularly frightening because the Allies could only produce about 130,000 tons of shipping. So the Germans are sinking 500,000 tons. The Allies can only launch 130,000 tons. That formula isn't going to last long. Great Britain is down to enough grain to only last a couple of weeks. They only have enough sugar on the islands of Great Britain to last 10 days, and there's a serious shortage of oil. This is when the U.S. Navy gets involved. Our naval goals, first of all, were to protect the United States East Coast. That made perfect sense, protect the East Coast. The second thing was to protect the Panama Canal and the Caribbean, our back door. We had just, built the Panama Canal, protect that. And then the British start pressing us to do more. They want us to do more. What they wanted us to do was to protect Allied shipping from the River Platte in South America, up the East Coast, across the North Atlantic to Europe. That's all. That's all they wanted us to do, was to protect shipping from South America to the European theater. Why is that? You thought you had, don't you have the Royal Navy? And it turns out that the American Admiral William S. Sims, who eventually commanded all of the American forces, very ably, by the way, spoke to the first Sea Lord, Admiral Jellicoe. He became the Sea Lord, not the Admiral of the fleet. And Jellicoe eventually admitted that the Royal Navy was not up to the task. The world's greatest navy could not protect its own merchant fleet, could not protect its own coast, could not feed its soldiery or its citizens. About 25% of the British ships that were setting out into the Atlantic were being sunk, and they could only replace about 10%. So again, that formula was tipped in the Germans' favor. It was not good. Well, luckily for the Allies, the United States jumps in with their doughboys and with their naval personnel. The U.S. Navy, before we got involved in the war, was about 65,000. By the end of the war, we're up to 550,000 men serving in the Navy. So the enlistment just takes off. And it's not just men that enlist, but it's women as well. We had our yeomanettes. And here we see a couple of pictures of yeomanettes from the First World War. About 11,500 young women signed up to be members of the U.S. Navy. They did, of course, office jobs. They didn't serve in combat in any way. Office jobs, stenography and typing, that sort of thing. Nursing, certainly. The nice thing was they were paid, they had equal rank and equal pay to the men, which would be very unexpected. The not so nice thing is, as soon as the war ended, they were all decommissioned. But here we see some yeomanettes, And I've got to admit, the top picture is one of my favorite pictures that I use in lectures on one thing or another. You can see them in their naval uniforms there, very 19 teens. And apparently everyone, you know, they were told, okay, unit, everybody face right, put your hands on the hips of the woman in front of you, turn to the left and smile at the camera. So here we are. We see an old timer there with his white mustache up in the back, some sort of petty officer or whatever in the front. But what I really love, is the third lady in from the right. Because she does not have her hands on the hips of the girl in front of her. So there seems to be some sort of special relationship that is developed in this small naval unit between that lovely young lady and that handsome gentleman to her right. So they just had to hold hands as they had the picture taken. I get a big kick out of that. So off goes the United States to take part in the First World War, and we find out fairly early on the the Royal Navy admits that it cannot protect its own people, it cannot feed its own people, it cannot keep supplies coming to the Western theater. What we need is ways to counter the submarine warfare. That's what we really need. One of the things we do is we send submarine chasers. The first of those, we only send a handful, as it turns out, at the very start of our involvement, but that number grows and grows until about 440 of them are built. 120 United States submarine chasers serve in European waters. Another 100 are given to the French. So about half of those that we build are in European waters. The other half are looking for subs on our own coast. So all of them involved in the war effort. Some on the western side of the Atlantic with us, some on the eastern side of the Atlantic involved in activities over there. And another thing we got involved in that you don't hear much about anymore was what was known as the mine barrage. We were particularly involved in the mine barrage that you see going across from the independent state, perhaps, of Scotland to Europe. This, as they call it, barrage, this minefield was 35 miles wide, 250 miles long. And much of the American naval energy went into this technology, laying this new modern technology. On the right-hand side, you see a World War I mine. Of course, you recognize the round part is the floaty part, where the explosives are. The other is an anchor with a cable device. So you drop it into the sea, and the anchor goes down. The cable rolls out, and that anchor goes down to the bottom and holds the mine in place, at least in theory. And so we lay down this massive minefield. You can see there were other ones that were laid out as well to protect English harbors and things. We spent about $40 million laying the mine barrage, 56,000 of them laid out there in that one swath across the North Sea. As it turns out, they were only minimally successful. Must have been a job to pick them all back up again, that's all I can figure. But we were very much involved in that because we were very committed to new technologies, and this is one way we use technologies successfully. Actually, looking at the anchor of that mine reminds me of some years ago I was involved in an oral history project with the Stonington fishing fleet. That's where I heard about, well no, that was a Gloucester guy, the other story, but I was over at in Stonington Borough with the fishing docks, and there was all sorts of hubbub on the dock, and the president of the Stonington Fishermen's Society Association had come in, and on the work deck of the boat there was this kind of big brass thing. Sure looked military to these guys. And so they had called the local Department of Defense. And they had sent off, nobody in New London knew what to do about this thing. They had actually sent off to Quonset, Rhode Island to get an expert on naval explosive devices. And and everybody was, the firemen came and the police came and they cleared off the whole fishing board. And for good reason, because on at least one occasion, Stonington fishermen had died at the hands of torpedoes they had brought up in the net. It was one vessel, they there was a torpedo hanging in its net, and as it hung there, it exploded, killed all but one of the men on board. So these guys knew not to mess. And so we waited around a couple of hours, and eventually this expert in his camouflage uniform shows up and kind of looking, and this is before cell phones on, he's kind of taking notes, and he's looking here, comes over to one side, and eventually he goes, back. Nothing happened. And he decided it was the anchor part, is what it was. It was a big brass box that was the anchor. So, but it took a good kick and a little thought before he determined that it wasn't going to blow him. So anyway, we're involved, right? We're in the mine barrage, we're in anti-submarine affairs, all of that. But the most important thing that we did in a maritime sense was to get our boys over there. And here we see an idealized image of the boys singing over there. As you know, our boys did play a major role in the war. It was they that tipped the balance and finally broke through on the Western Front, along with their allies, but it was the Yankee boys there that made all the difference. And not only the boys themselves, but then all the supplies. And you can see the modern supply train here in the lower right-hand picture, First World War. Lots of horses and mules sacrificed to that war along with human beings. And so between the supplies and the human beings that we sent, America's role in the war was absolutely vital. So off go our boys to the Western Front and all of its horrors, many of them coming back, having suffered from gas attacks and the rest. And the exhibit can introduce you to all of that, so please do go look at it. But here on this side, we also needed to build the vessels. We had a small navy, kind of a second-rate navy by this time, and so the U.S. government formed the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which organized and funded the building of cargo vessels, troop ships, petroleum carriers, and all the rest. It wasn't just Navy vessels. Certainly we built them, like these submarine chases that we see here. But we also created shipyard after shipyard. For the first time, really, since the Civil War, tax dollars going in a big way into the military. 203 shipyards were built, about 300,000 workers in those shipyards, with 1,000 launching wheels to build the vessels, not just the Navy vessels, but just as importantly, the merchant vessels that would carry those cargoes and those troops. New innovations, of course, war always brings about innovation. Arc welding for the first time. Vessels were built of steel, not just iron. Some of the Navy vessels now have not just steam engines with pistons and cylinders, but diesel-fired turbine engines for high speed. That's coming along. They even built ships with concrete hulls. Concrete will float. You just have to shape it such, like a ship, that it pushes more water away than it weighs, right? If you displace more water than you weigh, Archimedes told us, I think it was him, then you stay afloat. I do that just so you know. If you ever see me out there sometime, don't assume that I'm pushing away more water than I weigh. I'm a sinker personally. But concrete ships, they build a small fleet of concrete ships. So off we go. And all told, not counting the naval vessels, about 2,000 ships were built for the war effort in 1917, 1918, and beyond, as you'll hear. So America's weight is thrown behind the Allied effort. What about the submarines, though? Because Germany thought they could stop. Oh, by the way, the Germans also planted sea mines. In fact, there were some planted at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay. Let me see, how many vessels did they sink? They sank 10 ships in 10 days at the mouth of Chesapeake and Delaware Bay, right here on the East Coast, including the armored cruiser San Diego, not just merchant ships, but this naval vessel as well. That one was just 10 miles south of Fire Island when she went down. Turns out, when you know, that those mines were laid by a German U-boat. Not a surface vessel, but a German submarine laid those mines and took those tolls. Other German U-boats were on the American coast, sinking about 93 American vessels at that time. They were very busy. but we found a way to counter the U-boat threat. And that way really boiled down to building more ships. With us in there now, we could build more ships at a faster rate, and now we also found a way to protect them. By the time the Second World War comes along, we're very familiar with this, and they had systems like this back in the days of sail, but nothing like the convoy systems that were developed during the First World War. And they found, essentially like the herding strategy that grazing animals use, if you herd the hunters, much less successful. Percentage-wise, much less successful. And then if you protect that herd a bit, as we see in this image from the British press in the lower right, you don't just send a bunch of merchant vessels out there together on their own, you also send naval protection, destroyers, and submarine chasers. And what we see here is an artist's rendition of an Allied merchant fleet under threat from a U-boat attack, and a destroyer circling behind it, letting a smoke screen. And of course, with the technologies of those days, if you lost a visual contact with your target, then that target was safe for the time. And then, of course, that destroyer or minesweeper or mine chaser, submarine chaser would come back and threaten you. So time for you to do the running. And so we come toward the end of the war. The U-boat has been compromised. The Western Front has been turned by the arrival of the doughboys, and Germany is forced to the peace table. And so peace is declared. Interesting little and really very sad twist to this. The German military gets word back to Berlin. We think the Western Front is about to collapse. With the Americans here and the Allies, increased materiel and manpower, they could break through anytime. We suggest that you sue for peace and you bring this thing to an end. And so the diplomats and the politicians back in Berlin contact the Allies and say, let's find a way to put this thing to rest. And so they do. On the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice is signed. And at that point, the German military says, look what those politicians did. We've been sacrificing blood and treasure, all of the suffering, all of the loss, and then they stab us in the back. How dare they do that? We're forced to surrender. And of course, that's the myth that carries on. And those that survived the First World War are that loss, that stab in the back is carried on in their mind and in their memory. People like Adolf Hitler spend the rest of their lives believing that it was the businessmen and it was the politicians back miles behind their sacrifice. So that generation is looking to settle the score come the 1930s. Very tragic end. But the war does come to an end. Maritime-wise, we've got a strong Navy. By the way, our capital ships had very little effect. They kind of sat around. They didn't do very much. Our big battleships that we built, our heavy cruisers didn't really do much because, again, those big surface ships ended up just being a sidelight to the war. But what did change was the size of the American foreign fleet. Instead of being a third-rate merchant fleet, we were one of the strongest merchant fleets in the world. By 1922, 22% of the world's fleet was under the American flag. The war had sort of boosted us up to this superpower status when it came to being a competitive nation state. The downside to that was, and I'll just finish with this and then take questions, there was this enormous, there's 1,000 launching ways of all of these vessels, all that tonnage, and then of course when the war comes to an end, the world economy slows down, right? Goes into a recession, eventually a depression. So there's all this tonnage that has nowhere to go. There's no goods to carry. And the American people in the American Congress says, gee, all these tax dollars sitting around getting rusty, what do? Let's sell them. And so they sell off most of the ships that were built for the war emergency. On average, by 1922, they're selling them off at 8 cents to the dollar of building cost. So for every tax dollar spent to build them, they sell them for 8 cents. And don't you know, of course, most of them are sold to foreign competitors. So we end up back in the hole again. So, there we are. There's some maritime stuff about the First World War. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, sir.
Was Lenin and the end of the Russian Revolution any effect at all on the war?
Oh, big effect, because as soon as the Tsar was overthrown, the Russians sued for peace, and all those Germans fighting on the Eastern Front turned to the West. That was very bad for the Allies, when Russia basically said, we're out, as Lenin consolidated his power. Yeah, that was very scary for the Western Allies. Yeah. All that much more important that the United States got involved. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What happened to Kaiser Wilhelm after the war?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know.
I actually know
How
he
in the hell?
was forced to abdicate, and he retired to Belgium as a private citizen and remained there until, was he?
Okay.
Holland, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And Wilson forced a democratic government on them, which again was part of that, look what they've done to us thing, that the next generation is so angry about. Yes, thank you. Right. Yes, sir.
Curious about the length of time it took to build these ships. I mean, we had such an explosion of submarine chases, for example.
Yeah.
How quickly could they build those once they had the formula down for building them?
Before the war, it took months and months. Once they got themselves organized, they could cut it down to somewhere between a month and 6 or 7 weeks.
Wow.
Very rapid, certainly for those days. Of course, we see even a better expression of that come the Second World War with the Liberty ships, where the average vessel was launched in four weeks. They even did one of those in 1 week as a propaganda thing. Lined up all the parts, all the bits and pieces, said, go! A week later, they launched it. But yeah, again, that's part of the efficiency that comes with those emergencies.
Actually, the fastest Liberty ship was built in 37.5 hours.
Really?
Really. They laid the keel at noon, and it was a publicity stunt. They
Yeah.
parked all the pieces together, and they just threw it together, and then they just shoved it 37.5 hours. Robin Moore.
Did
named the ship.
They did periodically split in half.
They did.
Only the ones on the Murmansk run, and they were only ones that had been used in the tropics and then shifted to Arctic convoys, and it caused metal fractures, and that's why they split.
Yeah, that's true.
It wasn't due to the welding or the design of the ship, it was due to metal fatigue.
Yeah, that's true.
And there were only 6 of them that split.
Yes, sir.
When did aircraft carriers come into
Well, of course, aircraft established themselves during the First World War. The famous dogfights with the Red Baron and all of that. And so it was in the 1920s that all of these nations began looking at using air and naval power together. Of course, it was Billy Mitchell, if I remember correctly, that did the first experiments of launching planes from ships. And took some of these old battleships and sank them from, with bombs. And again, the old capital ship, the old battleship guys still didn't like that idea.
Maybe that's why they sold them for 8 cents on the dollar, because it was old technology, and once the planes came in, as Billy Mitchell proved, you can have your dreadnoughts, we'll knock them out of the water
Yeah.
with planes.
Yeah, the 8 cents was merchant vessels, though, not naval vessels. But yeah. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I'm aware of is that the first aircraft carrier that was built in the 1920s was built on the hull of a cruiser that was never finished.
Yes.
And then from then on, I guess in the 30s, when they built the Essex class carriers, which were the Enterprise, and I think there were 4 of them built. But one thing that I would like to just mention is that we're living through history today, because you mentioned earlier that Hitler and the German people who really were in remorse from losing the First World War, it's the same thing we're dealing with now with Putin.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. That man is absolutely committed to making Russia great again. Oh, scary. Yeah. And what do you do with guys like him? Yes.
Actually, there were 2 aviation-capable ships that were modified cruisers that sailed with the Grand Fleet in the Battle of Jutland. They carried seaplanes, and several of the light cruisers actually carried early seaplanes. but the weather was too rough and the visibility was too low, and they were gonna use them for tactical scouting 20 to 30 miles out. But actually, historically, the first carrier strike ever done was done from a converted seaplane carrier in the North Sea against the Zeppelin sheds in World War II, and you can read a very interesting account of that in Castles of Steel by, I think Edwin Massey is his name, and he devotes a whole chapter to the British use of carrier aircraft, a very primitive carrier aircraft, in an attempt to destroy some of the Zeppelin airships that, like the Hindenburg, or along AKA the Hindenburg, that were conducting terror raids on London and some of the South County, kind of Portsmouth and Yarmouth and London and Bristol and some of the other ports that they were just trying to, they were called, like Admiral Hipper conducted bombardments of English coastal towns, and that's why the Hope, the Gracie, and the Abacar were where they were, to be tripwire of Hipper coming out, because he bombarded about 6 English coastal towns and killed about 1,200 people.
Is that right?
Yeah, so it's roughly the equivalent of the casualties of Pearl Harbor, inflicted in over a 3-day period with his battle cruisers.
Yeah, speaking of books, I will mention, if you want to get a sense of particularly the convoy world, you'll want to read The Cruel Sea by
Montserrat.
Montserrat.
Thank you, right, yeah.
Compass Rose,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, great stuff. Well, if you have other questions, folks, one last one, yes.
Wondered what was happening as a response to the submarines in terms of developing our own submarine.
We were doing that, we were working on that as well, yeah. The Germans were in advance of us, but we were working on it. The Germans actually even had cargo submarines. One of the Deutschland came in to a couple of American ports during the war. Now it sank some ships off the coast, which is good. All right, thank you, folks.
Thank you.